Hollywood sold illusions, but behind the lights, something quieter was happening. Stars were walking off set with pieces of the films themselves, not always stealing, not always asking, just taking. Sometimes for memory, sometimes for power, sometimes for reasons no one fully understood. And once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Because what they took reveals far more than what they left behind. Gene Kelly. There is something quietly revealing about what a performer chooses to keep when the cameras stop rolling. For Gene Kelly, it was never about greed or vanity. It was about preservation, about memory, about holding on to the rhythm of a moment that could never be recreated once the set was dismantled and the lights went dark. Kelly was known to take items from his films, but not in the reckless sense that others did. He kept dance shoes, costumes, pieces that had absorbed sweat effort and repetition. During productions like Singin' in the Rain, those items were not just wardrobe. They were extensions of his body. Every step, every spin, every perfectly timed movement was built into them. To discard them would have meant discarding part of the performance itself. Crew members often noticed that he treated these items with a kind of reverence. He did not grab things impulsively. He selected them carefully, almost ceremonially. It was as if he understood something others did not, that Hollywood was temporary, that sets were illusions, that once filming ended, everything would be broken apart and forgotten. Studios rarely objected because Kelly was not disruptive. He was disciplined, focused, precise. And, in many ways, his habit aligned with something deeper inside the industry. A silent acceptance that certain artists earned the right to take pieces of their work home with them. But here is what makes this detail fascinating. Those shoes and costumes were not trophies. They were reminders of perfection, of control, of artistry that demanded absolute physical and emotional commitment. Kirk Douglas. Strength, power, authority. These were not just traits that Kirk Douglas portrayed on screen. They were qualities he carried into every set he stepped onto. And when filming ended, Douglas did not always leave empty-handed. He walked away with pieces that symbolized that power. During productions like Spartacus, Douglas became deeply connected to the physical world of the film. The armor, the weapons, with the weight of history recreated for the camera. These were not simple props. They were instruments that helped him transform into something larger than himself. And when the production wrapped, Douglas kept some of those items. Swords, costumes, objects that represented the scale and intensity of the role. Unlike quieter actors who took items for memory, Douglas seemed to take them as extensions of identity, as if the character had not fully left him. What makes this behavior compelling is how normalized it became. Studios understood his importance, his influence, his ability to carry massive productions. Challenging him over props was not worth the conflict. In many cases, it was easier to let him keep what he wanted. There are accounts from crew members who describe this as part of his presence. Douglas did not ask in the traditional sense. He claimed, calmly, confidently, without hesitation, and rarely did anyone push back. But beneath that confidence, there was something else. A desire to hold on to the magnitude of the roles he played, to keep a physical reminder of the worlds he helped build. Charlton Heston. Some actors leave a film with memories. Others leave with something far more tangible. Charlton Heston belonged to the second group, but unlike reckless personalities who grabbed whatever they could, Heston approached it with a sense of historical ownership, as if the artifacts of cinema were extensions of human history itself. During the production of Ben-Hur, Heston was immersed in one of the most ambitious spectacles ever created. Massive sets, thousands of extras, authentic recreations of ancient worlds. Every object on that set carried weight. Cultural weight, emotional weight. And for Heston, those objects were not disposable. They were pieces of something monumental. When filming ended, Heston kept items from the production, costumes, props, pieces that symbolized the scale of what had been achieved. And unlike many actors who hid such behavior, Heston spoke openly about preserving these items. He did not frame it as theft. He framed it as stewardship. Crew members often described him as meticulous and respectful. He did not snatch things impulsively. He selected them with intention, almost like a curator, deciding what deserved to survive beyond the set. Studios rarely challenged him because his reasoning carried weight. He was not taking for vanity. He was preserving history. But here is where it becomes interesting. That sense of entitlement did not come from arrogance alone. It came from belief. A belief that certain performances transcended entertainment, that they became part of something permanent, and that the objects used to create them deserved to be saved. This mindset reveals something deeper about Hollywood during that era. The idea that stars were not just performers. They were custodians of culture, and that gave them permission to cross boundaries others could not. Errol Flynn. If Hollywood ever had a figure who treated life like an adventure without rules, it was Errol Flynn. His on-screen image as a daring swordsman was not an act. It was a reflection of who he was. And when it came to taking items from sets, Flynn did not operate with subtlety or justification. He simply did it. During the height of his career, Flynn starred in swashbuckling epics, filled with elaborate costumes and finely crafted weapons. Swords became extensions of his identity. Costumes became symbols of his larger-than-life persona. And when filming wrapped, Flynn often walked away with these items as if they belonged to him. Crew members described his behavior as unpredictable, but oddly accepted. He would take swords directly from productions. Not quietly, not discreetly, but with a kind of charm that made it difficult to confront him. Flynn had a way of turning rule-breaking into entertainment. Studios tolerated it because Flynn was valuable. He was a box office force, a star who could draw audiences with ease. Challenging him over props was seen as unnecessary conflict. And so the line between ownership and indulgence blurred further. What makes Flynn different from others on this list is intent. There was no preservation, no sentimental reasoning. It was instinct, impulse, a reflection of a life lived without restraint. Taking items from sets was just another extension of that lifestyle. And yet, those objects became part of his legend. Stories of Flynn collecting swords and costumes only added to his myth. The actor who lived like the characters he played. Joan Crawford. Control defined everything about Joan Crawford. Control over her image. Control over her performances. Control over every detail that shaped how the world saw her. And when it came to film sets, that control extended beyond the camera. It reached into the very objects that surrounded her. Crawford was known for taking wardrobe pieces and select props from productions. But unlike others, this was never impulsive. It was calculated, intentional. She believed the items she wore on screen were part of her identity as a star. Not just costumes, but extensions of the persona she had carefully constructed over years of relentless work. During films like Mildred Pierce, her costumes were not random selections. They were crafted to reflect power, ambition, and transformation. Crawford understood that. She lived inside that image. So when production ended, she often kept those items as if reclaiming something that already belonged to her. Crew members rarely challenged her, not because they were unaware, but because Crawford commanded respect through discipline and intensity. She was known to be demanding, exacting, and deeply invested in every detail of her roles. Questioning her decisions was not something many were willing to risk. What makes her story compelling is the psychology behind it. This was not about possession for pleasure. It was about control, about maintaining a grip on the image that defined her career. Keeping those items meant preserving the illusion she had built so carefully. Hollywood allowed it because stars like Crawford were the system. They were the product, the investment. And in that environment, the boundaries of ownership became flexible. Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds carried a different kind of energy onto film sets. Relaxed, charismatic, effortlessly confident. He was not driven by control or preservation. He was driven by enjoyment. And when it came to taking items from sets, His approach reflected that attitude perfectly. Reynolds was known for walking away with props, costumes, and even vehicles from his films. During productions like Smokey and the Bandit, the line between work and play blurred constantly. The cars, the clothing, the accessories all became part of a larger experience that Reynolds fully embraced. Unlike others who operated quietly, Reynolds often made it part of the process. There are accounts suggesting he would negotiate ownership of certain items after filming. Other times, he simply kept them with little resistance from the studio. His charm played a major role in that dynamic. He made it difficult for anyone to push back. What separates Reynolds from earlier names on this list is tone. There was no intensity behind his actions, no deep psychological need. It was casual, almost playful, as if taking a piece of the film was just another way to extend the fun beyond production. Studios tolerated it because Reynolds delivered results. He was a major box office draw, a personality audiences connected with instantly. Allowing him to keep props was a small price to maintain that relationship. Yet even in that light-hearted approach, there is something revealing. It shows how far the boundaries had shifted. What began as quiet souvenir taking had evolved into something openly accepted, even expected. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra did not walk onto a set like a typical actor. He arrived with presence, with authority, with an aura that made everyone around him adjust their behavior without being told. And when filming ended, Sinatra rarely left without taking something with him. It was usually subtle: a suit, a tie, a carefully tailored piece of wardrobe that fit him perfectly. These were not random selections. Sinatra understood style better than most. He knew how clothing shaped perception, how it reinforced identity, and when a film provided him with something that matched his personal image, he kept it. Crew members often noticed that these items blended seamlessly into his real-life wardrobe. There was no separation between the man and the character. The suits he wore on screen became the suits he wore off-screen. It was as if the film had simply expanded his personal collection. Studios did not fight it. Sinatra was too powerful, too influential. His presence brought credibility and commercial value. Losing a few wardrobe pieces was insignificant compared to what he delivered. But what makes Sinatra's behavior stand out is how effortlessly he did it. There was no drama, no confrontation. He simply moved through the environment as if ownership naturally shifted toward him. And in many ways it did. This reveals something deeper about Hollywood's hierarchy. At a certain level, rules stopped being rules. They became suggestions. And stars like Sinatra operated above them. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart did not need extravagant costumes to define his presence. His power came from simplicity. A trench coat, a suit, a cigarette held with quiet confidence. And when filming ended, Bogart often kept those very items that shaped his unmistakable image. During productions like Casablanca, the wardrobe was more than clothing. It was character. The trench coat became a symbol of mystery, of emotional restraint, of a man who carried more than he revealed. Bogart understood that, and he kept those pieces as if they were part of him. Unlike louder personalities, Bogart's approach was understated. He did not make a show of taking items. He simply retained them, calmly, naturally, as if it required no explanation, and no one questioned him. Crew members often described his behavior as consistent with his personality. Direct, uncomplicated. He valued practicality. If something fit him and suited his identity, he saw no reason to leave it behind. Studios tolerated it because Bogart represented reliability. He delivered performances that resonated deeply with audiences. Challenging him over wardrobe was not worth disrupting that dynamic. But here is what elevates his story. Those items did not just remain personal possessions. They became part of cinematic history. The image of Bogart in a trench coat is not just a memory. It is an icon, and the fact that he kept those pieces only strengthens that connection. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor did not simply act in epic films. She lived inside them. She absorbed their scale, their emotion, their extravagance. And when production ended, she did not always walk away empty-handed. She carried pieces of that world with her. During the making of Cleopatra, one of the most lavish productions in Hollywood history, Taylor was surrounded by extraordinary costumes and jewelry. These were not ordinary props. They were crafted with precision and often held real value, and Taylor formed a deep connection with them. She was known to keep certain items from her films, especially jewelry, not in secrecy, but with a quiet confidence that reflected her status. Studios rarely challenged her because Taylor was not just a star. She was an institution. Her presence alone justified the cost of entire productions. Crew members often described how naturally this happened. There was no dramatic moment, no confrontation. Items simply transitioned from set to personal possession as if it were expected, as if it were part of the unspoken agreement between star and studio. What makes Taylor's case unique is the blend of personal passion and privilege. She genuinely loved jewelry. She appreciated craftsmanship. And the pieces she kept were not just reminders of roles. They were objects she valued deeply in her personal life. But beneath that elegance, there is a clear truth. Hollywood had created a system where certain individuals operated beyond limitation, where ownership became fluid, where value was defined by influence. John Wayne. John Wayne did not just play cowboys. He embodied them. His presence defined the Western genre. And on the sets of those films, the line between character and reality often disappeared completely. Wayne was known for taking props from his productions, especially items tied to his Western roles. Guns, hats, boots, leather gear. These were not just accessories. They were symbols of a persona that audiences believed in, and Wayne understood their importance. Unlike quieter actors, Wayne's approach was direct. He did not hide it. He did not over-explain it. If an item felt connected to his role, he kept it. And in many cases, no one questioned him. Studios tolerated this behavior because Wayne was one of the most reliable box office draws of his time. His films defined an era. Losing a few props was insignificant compared to the revenue he generated. Many of the items he kept later became part of collections and exhibitions. They were preserved not just as memorabilia, but as pieces of cinematic history. Objects tied to a figure who shaped an entire genre. What makes Wayne's story compelling is how normalized it became. On Western sets especially, the idea of actors keeping props felt almost built into the culture. The rugged authenticity of those productions extended beyond filming into real life. Bette Davis. Bette Davis did not pretend. She did not soften her image to fit expectations. She spoke directly, acted fiercely, and when it came to taking items from film sets, she did something even more unusual. She admitted it. Davis openly acknowledged that she kept costumes from her films. Not secretly, not with hesitation, but with a level of honesty that revealed how normalized the practice had become for major stars. To her, these were not stolen goods. They were earned extensions of performances that demanded everything she had. During productions, Davis formed strong connections with her wardrobe. Costumes were not decoration. They were psychological tools. They shaped posture expression and emotional tone. And once filming ended, she saw no reason to leave behind something that had become part of her work. Crew members often described her as uncompromising. She knew her value. She understood her impact. And she carried herself with the authority of someone who had fought hard to reach that level. If she chose to keep something, it was rarely questioned. Studios tolerated it because Davis delivered powerful performances that elevated every project she touched. Challenging her over costumes would have seemed trivial in comparison. The balance of power was clear. But what makes her story significant is the transparency. She did not hide behind excuses or romanticize the act. She simply treated it as part of the system. A system that quietly allowed its biggest stars to operate by different rules. Clark Gable. Clark Gable was not just a star. He was the standard. The face of Hollywood masculinity during its most influential era. And when someone holds that level of power, the rules begin to bend in ways that others could never imagine. Gable was known to take wardrobe pieces and props from his films, particularly during his time with MGM. Suits, accessories, and personal items often followed him off the set without resistance. It was not done with secrecy. It was done with quiet certainty. Crew members understood the hierarchy. Gable was essential to the studio's success. His films defined the industry. And in that environment, small losses were insignificant compared to the value he generated. What makes his behavior fascinating is how effortless it appeared. There was no need for justification, no need for negotiation. Ownership seemed to transfer simply because of who he was. The system adjusted around him. This reveals something critical about old Hollywood. Say, power was not just about fame. It was about control over the environment, over decisions, over boundaries that others were expected to respect. For Gable, taking items from a set was not rebellion. It was routine, a quiet reflection of his position at the very top of the industry. James Dean. James Dean did not behave like a traditional star because he never intended to be one. He resisted structure, questioned authority, and carried a restless energy that made every set feel unpredictable. So when it came to taking items from film productions, his actions were not calculated or justified. They were instinctive. During films like Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant Dean became deeply attached to the clothing he wore on screen. The red jacket, the worn denim, the boots that carried his physical presence through emotionally charged scenes. These were not just wardrobe pieces. They were part of the character's identity, and in many ways, part of his own. Dean was known to keep these items after filming sometimes, without asking. Not out of entitlement in the traditional sense, but because he blurred the line between performance and reality. If something felt like his, he took it. Simple as that. Crew members often found him difficult to predict. One moment he was intensely focused. The next, he was detached or rebellious. That unpredictability made confrontation unlikely. Studios tolerated his behavior, partly because of his rising star power, and partly because no one wanted to disrupt the fragile brilliance he brought to the screen. What makes Dean's story compelling is how personal it feels. This was not about power or privilege. It was about identity, about holding on to something that made sense in a world that often did not. And now, the tension increases, because the next name on this list represents something far more calculated. A star who understood image better than anyone and used it to quietly reshape what belonged to her. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe understood something that many others did not. That image was everything. That every detail, every accessory, every carefully chosen piece of wardrobe contributed to the illusion the audience fell in love with. And when filming ended, she did not always leave those details behind. Monroe was known for keeping costumes, jewelry, and accessories from her films. Items from productions like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes did not simply return to storage. They followed her into her personal life, where they continued to reinforce the persona she had built with such precision. This was not reckless behavior. It was deliberate. Monroe knew the value of what she wore. She understood how it shaped perception. And by keeping those items, she maintained control over that image beyond the boundaries of the set. Studios often allowed it because Monroe was more than a performer. She was a phenomenon. Her presence generated attention revenue and cultural impact that few could match. Losing a few costumes was insignificant compared to what she brought to the industry. But beneath that calculated control, there was also vulnerability. Monroe's connection to these items was not purely strategic. They represented moments where everything aligned, where she felt powerful, seen, in control. And as we reach the final position, the pattern reaches its peak. Because the next actor did not just take items from sets. She built something far larger out of it, something that would outlive the films themselves. Bette Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds did not take items from film sets in the way others did. She did something far more significant. She saved them. At a time when studios routinely discarded costumes and props, Reynolds recognized their value long before the industry did. She began acquiring items from productions, including pieces from Singin' in the Rain, not out of impulse, but out of purpose. She understood that these objects represented the history of Hollywood itself. What started as a personal effort grew into one of the most important private collections of film memorabilia ever assembled. Costumes that would have been lost forever were preserved because Reynolds refused to let them disappear. Her approach transformed the narrative. This was no longer about taking for personal use. It was about protecting a legacy, about ensuring that future generations could see and understand the artistry that defined an era. Studios eventually recognized the importance of what she had done, but at the time, her actions stood apart from the norm. She saw value where others saw expendable material. This makes her position at the top of this list unique, because while others took items as souvenirs or symbols of identity, Reynolds turned the act into preservation, into something lasting. And when you step back and look at the entire picture, one truth becomes clear. Hollywood was never just about what appeared on screen. It was about what remained behind, the objects, the stories, the pieces of history that stars chose to keep. Now here is the question. If you had the chance to take one piece from your favorite film, would you leave it behind? Or would you carry that moment with you forever? Because in Hollywood, the real story is not just what was filmed. It is what disappeared after the camera stopped.